Lanterns swung on thin wires inside the town barn, throwing trembling halos of gold across tables crowded with stew bowls, fiddles, and voices that had forgotten mercy. It was harvest supper night, the one evening every soul in Coldwater dared to laugh too loud, and Evelyn Ward wished she could trade her heartbeat for silence. She moved through the crowd with a basket of rolls balanced against her chest, eyes down, shoulders tight beneath a borrowed dress that smelled faintly of soap and smoke. Across the room her sister Margaret shone brighter than the lamps, lace sleeves, painted lips, that cruel little smile she saved for family. "Don't drop anything this time, Evie," she sang, loud enough for the whole barn. Laughter answered. Men leaned back on benches. Even the pastor's wife hid a grin behind her cup. Then Margaret turned toward the doorway where a tall rancher had just stepped in from the rain. "Why, Sam Redden," she called. "Our Evie's still free. Perhaps she'll fetch your plate tonight." The words landed like spit on a wound. Evelyn froze, basket trembling, the crowd's gaze burning through her like prairie noon. A roll tumbled to the floor. Someone snickered. Before she could bend, the rancher crossed the sawdust and stooped first. He lifted the bread, brushed it clean with a gloved hand, and set it gently back. "Guess supper's better when a man earns it," he said, voice quiet enough to shame thunder. The barn fell still. Lantern chains clicked, the fiddle's bow hovered mid-air, and Margaret's painted smile cracked like thin ice. Samuel Redden straightened, eyes sweeping the room once, then resting on Evelyn, steady, calm, unembarrassed, as though daring anyone to laugh again. None did. Somewhere a dog barked outside, and the sound carried through the open loft like a signal that the night had turned. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. Gratitude and humiliation wrestled for breath. She turned and slipped toward the doors, the crowd parting without words. Cold air met her face, sharp with rain. Behind her, the fiddler tried to rescue the moment with a clumsy tune, but the rhythm had lost its joy. On the threshold, wind tugged the ribbon from Evelyn's hair, a small strip of pale blue satin her sister had tossed aside that morning, and it fluttered across the floor, stopping near Samuel's boots. He looked down, and for an instant his jaw softened, as if the ribbon were something sacred, a memory he'd once meant to keep. Margaret watched him notice it, and went still. Pride twisting into something darker. Evelyn didn't see. She was already outside, rain pinning her dress to her knees. She leaned against the fence rail, trembling, watching the lantern glow spill out of the barn windows and blur in the drizzle. "Just one night without shame, Lord," she whispered. The wind caught her words and sent them back through the doorway where the ribbon waited, glinting like a promise dropped between two strangers. Inside, Samuel bent, picked it up, and folded it carefully into his coat pocket before following the sound of rain that would carry him to the next chapter of both their lives. Rain hammered the barn roof long after the music died, drowning out gossip but not regret. Samuel Redden stood alone near the empty tables, hat in hand, watching lamplight tremble over puddles. He was not a man built for company. Silence had been his neighbor for years, ever since a fever took his wife and left him with acres of work and no reason to sing. But tonight, silence felt heavier, filled with words he hadn't said when Margaret Ward mocked her sister. He could still hear Evelyn's small voice breaking against the noise, could still see that ribbon lying like a wounded bird on the floor. The men had gone home to their wives, the women to their stories, and only the storm kept him company. He moved to the doorway and looked out into the rain-smeared dark. She was there, Evelyn, standing near the corral fence, soaked to her bones, clutching her shawl with both hands as if it held her dignity together. For a long moment he said nothing, Just let the quiet stretch wide between them. Then he walked out, boots sinking in mud. "You'll catch cold," he said. She startled, turned, eyes wide, half ashamed, half thankful. "I'm used to cold," she whispered. He could have answered, could have said something about firewood or shelter, but words felt wrong coming from a man known more for his back than his tongue. Instead, he shrugged off his coat and draped it around her shoulders. She flinched at the gesture, then held it closed. "You didn't have to stand up for me," she murmured. "Your sister shouldn't have needed reminding that cruelty isn't clever," he replied. His tone carried no anger, only fatigue, the kind born of too many winters. She searched his face as if looking for mockery, found none, and looked down. "They'll talk worse now," she said. "They already do," he answered. The rain softened into mist, and from somewhere deep in the night, a church bell struck 9, its echo folding through the valley like a tired heart. Samuel lifted his hat, nodded once, and started toward his horse tethered by the post. "You live near the ridge?" he asked. "Past it," she said. "Too far to walk." He untied the reins and gestured to the saddle. "Then ride." She hesitated. Proper girls didn't climb onto ranchers' horses, but the barn light behind them threw her sister's laughter against the walls again, and shame cut deeper than fear. Evelyn took his hand. When he pulled her up behind him, the motion felt less like rescue than balance found. Neither spoke as they rode through mud and thunder, wind scattering drops from his brim into her hair. The lantern glow faded behind them until only the storm remained, and in its noise she heard something strange, his breathing steady, like a man used to carrying more than his share. They reached the ridge just as the rain thinned to silver threads. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me for what ain't real," he replied, voice low but not unkind. She stared at the back of his neck, at the scar that caught the moonlight, and wondered what truth he meant to hide. Neither of them knew that by morning the whole town would swear they'd seen a married pair ride out together. By dawn, the storm had drained itself into mist, leaving the valley washed clean but trembling. Evelyn stood beside the corral fence, Samuel's coat still heavy on her shoulders, steam curling from the horses' flanks as morning light slid across the horizon. Neither had slept. They'd reached his ranch just before the thunder died, and she'd refused his bedroll, choosing the porch bench instead, her hands folded tight over borrowed warmth. He brewed coffee in silence, poured a tin cup for her, and leaned against the post, eyes fixed on the far hills where fog clung like memory. "They'll be talkin' by now," he said quietly. "Margaret's tongue rides faster than any horse." Evelyn's fingers tightened on the cup. "Then let them talk," she whispered, though her voice shook. "They'll call me names I can't wash off." He turned, brow furrowed. "You think I care for gossip?" "No," she said, staring at the mud-streaked hem of her dress. "But I do." For a moment neither spoke. The wind moved through the grass with the hush of something deciding. Then she lifted her head, eyes wide, desperate but resolute. "Pretend to be my husband, Samuel, just until the town quiets." The words startled even her, hanging in the cold air between coffee steam and disbelief. Samuel blinked once, his jaw shifting. "You're talking foolish." "Am I?" she said. "They saw us ride out. They'll believe it anyway. If you don't say it's true, I'll carry shame alone." He stared at her, this thin, trembling woman who had endured laughter without tears, and found he couldn't summon the scorn he wanted. He set down his cup and stepped closer. "A lie don't wash cleaner than truth," he said. "But sometimes it keeps a person warm till morning," she replied, voice barely more than breath. The sentence hung there, so fragile, yet full of spine, that he almost smiled. The porch clock ticked, one stubborn sound in all that quiet. Then he nodded once. "Just till morning," he said. She shook her head slowly. "Till they forget." He sighed. "They never do." But he lifted her hand anyway, resting it briefly against his chest before letting go. Inside, the young ranch hand Tom peeked through the window, eyes wide. He'd seen enough to carry a story to town before breakfast. Evelyn followed Samuel to the hitching post, her skirt brushing the wet grass, her face half lit by sunrise. "What do we tell them?" she asked. "Nothin'," he said, tightening the saddle cinch. "Silence'll do the talkin'." When they rode toward town, dew sparkled like shards of glass, and birds rose startled from the fence line. The main street was already awake, men sweeping porches, women hanging wash. Conversations halted as the pair appeared. Her wrapped in his coat, him straight-backed but unreadable. Someone dropped a broom. Another whispered, "He finally wed." Evelyn's stomach fluttered, but Samuel didn't flinch. He swung down, offered his arm, and she took it. Together they walked through the square toward the churchyard, where the gossip grew loudest. Margaret stood among the wives, eyes wide as thunder. Evelyn met her gaze and, just for once, didn't look away. Samuel tipped his hat to the preacher, whose mouth hung open. "Morning," he said. "Seems I got myself a wife after all." The crowd murmured. Margaret's face drained pale as linen. Evelyn's knees nearly gave. But Samuel's hand stayed firm at her back, guiding her forward as though it had always belonged there. And though she knew every step was built on pretense, she also knew that, for the first time in her life, humiliation had traded places with pride. Somewhere behind them, church bells began to ring for Sunday. Louder, faster, as if the valley itself believed the lie they'd just spoken into truth. By noon, Coldwater Town buzzed like a hornet's nest. Church bells had long stopped ringing, yet their echo seemed trapped inside every mouth. "Married?" whispered Mrs. Carden at the dry goods store. "The quiet one with him?" The blacksmith swore he'd seen them ride in together at dawn, her in his coat, his hand steady on the reins. Within hours, the gossip had crossed every porch, spilled into every teacup, and climbed all the way to the ward's parlor, where Margaret sat stiff-backed beside her mother. "A lie," she hissed. "He wouldn't pick her over me." But even her mother's lips trembled as she said, "The town saw, child. The town saw." Outside, Evelyn walked through the same streets that had mocked her the night before, chin high, hands clasped tight before her, Samuel one step behind. People stopped sweeping, stopped breathing, watched. "Mornin'," Samuel said once, his voice calm as wood smoke. No one answered, but no one dared laugh either. When they passed the blacksmith's, the man muttered something about real courage under his breath, and that small kindness was enough to steady Evelyn's trembling hands. At the end of the street, the preacher caught up, face pale with excitement disguised as duty. "Mr. Redden," he called. "If it's true, the church must—" Samuel cut him off. "If it's true, it'll stand on its own." The man blinked, adjusting his collar, unused to being dismissed by anyone but the Lord. Evelyn wanted to disappear, but Samuel's silence wrapped her like armor. They reached the hitching post outside the general store, where she paused to gather breath. A child pointed at her ringless hand. His mother yanked him away. "I can't do this," Evelyn whispered. "You're doing it," Samuel said simply. He helped her onto the wagon bench, the motion so gentle the onlookers didn't know whether to stare harder or look away. The road home shimmered with heat and humiliation. Halfway up the ridge, she broke the quiet. "They'll turn on you too." "Let 'em," he replied. I've worked alone long enough to not miss company. But your trade, your name, ain't never been worth much till now. His words fell heavy, not defensive but honest, and for the first time she heard something in his voice that wasn't pity. It was choice. Behind them, the town bell tolled again, a false heartbeat marking the birth of their lie. By the time they reached his ranch gate, a rider approached fast from the valley, dust trailing behind like smoke. It was Margaret, bonnet askew, eyes aflame. She didn't dismount. "How dare you?" she shouted, voice cracking. "He's my—" Samuel stepped forward. "Your what?" The pause broke her composure. "My—" But she couldn't finish, because the truth was too ugly to fit inside pride. Evelyn stood beside him, shoulders straight, color returning to her cheeks. "Your joke?" she asked softly. Margaret froze, words clawing her throat. "This isn't over," she spat, spinning her horse. "It never is," Samuel muttered, as she vanished into the trees. Silence fell again, but it wasn't empty this time. The air between them pulsed with something raw, half fear, half beginning. From the porch, young Tom peeked out and whispered, "Should I tell folks you're home, Mr. Redden?" Samuel looked at Evelyn, at the woman who now carried his silence and his scandal in equal measure. "Tell him the truth," he said, mounting the steps. "Mr. and Mrs. Redden are taking their supper early." Tom's eyes widened, and by nightfall, that single sentence would set the valley on fire. Evening settled slow and amber, the kind that stretches shadows until they touch secrets. The air smelled of dust and pine, and thunder rumbled far beyond the ridge, promising another storm. Samuel had saddled the horses before she could offer help, and Evelyn stood at the rail watching him work, how he checked the reins twice, tied a second bedroll, then glanced up like he'd forgotten why he was being kind. "Town'll be talking worse tomorrow," he said. "Best you stay out here a while." She nodded, though fear rippled through her chest. "I can't stay in your house," she whispered. "Not alone, not with you." He didn't meet her gaze. "Ain't asking you to." He tossed a tarp over the saddle. "There's an old cabin west of the creek. Belonged to the Handley family before the fever took 'em. You'll have walls and quiet." She looked toward the hills where the sky bruised purple. "It'll rain before we reach it." "Then ride faster," he said. The tone was rough, but not unkind. When he helped her mount, his calloused hands brushed her wrist just once, steadying more than flesh. The horses started at a trot, hooves striking rhythm on the hard earth as the wind shifted colder. Half a mile out, the rain found them, thin, sharp needles that grew heavy fast. They didn't stop. The world narrowed to motion and breath. Evelyn's hair plastered against her neck, her skirt soaked heavy. Samuel slowed when she shivered, wordless, then swung his coat from his shoulders and threw it behind her without breaking pace. "I told you," she protested, clutching it around herself. "Told you you'd catch cold," he said. Lightning cut across the sky, blue, white, and fast, painting his face fierce and strangely young. For a while, no one spoke. The land blurred, the trail turned to mud, and the creek ahead roared with new water. "We'll have to cross," he said. "Hold tight." She obeyed without argument, wrapping her arms around his waist as they plunged into the current. The water bit like ice. She gasped, pressed her face against his back. He shouted something, she didn't hear what, but a heartbeat later they were through, soaked but alive. On the far bank, the cabin rose like a ghost, roof sagging, smoke hole open to the sky. He dismounted first, helped her down, then led the horses under the eave. "Get inside," he said. She hesitated, teeth chattering. "You'll freeze out here. I've frozen before." Still, he followed her in after tying the reins. The cabin was dark, but dry enough. He found old matches, struck one, lit a stub of candle that filled the room with amber light. She crouched near the hearth, wringing her skirt. He knelt beside her, dropped dry twigs into the grate, and coaxed a flame. The fire grew, crackling to life, painting her face with warmth. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. The shadows on his face moved slower than his thoughts. "'Cause I've seen too many good people freeze for someone else's pride," he said finally. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not a rescuer, but a man who'd already lost too much to walk away from what still lived. Outside, thunder cracked again, closer this time. The horses shifted restlessly. "We'll ride back tomorrow," he said. "Let him talk tonight." She nodded, staring at the fire. Her ribbon, his coat's pocket still held it, hung unseen between them like a bridge neither dared cross. And for the first time since her sister's cruel joke, Evelyn felt the burn of something she hadn't known she'd missed. Safety that looked like danger. By sunrise, word had outpaced truth. Before Samuel or Evelyn could return to town, half of Coldwater had already decided what kind of woman she was, and what kind of man he must be to keep her. The storekeeper's wife swore she saw a light in Samuel's cabin all night. The preacher's son claimed he'd seen them share a coat by the fire. Gossip galloped faster than any rider, and Margaret Ward made sure it didn't slow. She arrived at the sheriff's porch before breakfast, voice trembling with false concern. "My sister's been taken," she said. "Or worse, she's been ruined." By noon, Sheriff Harlan and 2 deacons were saddling their horses. The town gathered like a congregation scenting blood. The sky hung heavy and gray when Samuel and Evelyn rode back through the main street. She was pale but upright, chin high despite mud stains and sleepless eyes. Samuel's jaw was set like stone. He hadn't spoken since they broke camp. The silence between them had turned into something solid enough to carry. When the sheriff raised his hand, Samuel stopped the horse. "We've had complaints," Harlan said, voice echoing. "That's so?" Samuel asked. "A woman can't disappear overnight without word," Harlan continued, "especially not with a man." Margaret stepped from the crowd, face powdered, smile brittle. "Tell them, Evie," she said sweetly. "Tell them he forced you." Evelyn's heart thudded once, hard, every eye fixed on her. The preacher's wife whispered, "Lord, help her." Before she could speak, Samuel dismounted. He walked straight to the sheriff, hat in hand. "No one forced anything," he said evenly. "We're wed." The air cracked, soft gasps, muffled curses, disbelief rippling through the square. Margaret's smile fell apart. "That's a lie," she shouted. "You'd never choose her." Samuel turned to her, his calm colder than rain. "I didn't." The crowd stilled, hanging on the pause. "She chose me," he said, "and I said yes." The words landed like nails sealing a coffin, Margaret's pride buried beneath them. The preacher cleared his throat, flustered. "If this union's true, we'll need proof." Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out the blue ribbon, folded once, smooth despite the storm. He placed it in Evelyn's hand. "You dropped this the night we met," he said quietly. "Seems it found its place." Her eyes widened. She understood the message. The town saw only a symbol. Murmurs broke out. The sheriff rubbed his jaw. "Then I reckon it stands," he muttered. Margaret stepped forward, trembling. "You think this farce makes you respectable?" "No," Evelyn said softly. "It makes me seen." For the first time in her life, she didn't flinch saying it. Margaret's hand rose as if to strike her, but Samuel caught her wrist mid-air, firm but without anger. "You've done enough harm," he said. "Go home." She jerked free, tears slicing her rouge, and stormed away, the crowd parting in uneasy silence. Evelyn stood rooted, breath uneven, the ribbon pressed to her heart. The preacher murmured something about blessings, and the crowd began to disperse, muttering under their breath. Samuel placed a steadying hand on her back. "You did fine," he said quietly. "You made it truth." "But it isn't," she whispered. "Ain't it?" he asked, meeting her eyes. For a heartbeat, neither could tell where the lie ended and mercy began. The rain started again, not the violent kind this time, but slow, steady drops that blurred the dust, washing footprints into one long, shared trail leading home. The rain followed them all the way back to the ridge, soft and steady, like it had no intention of leaving them alone. By the time they reached Samuel's ranch, the horses were slick with water, and Evelyn's hands trembled from cold and shock. He lifted her down without a word, his touch careful, as though one wrong movement might shatter what the day had built. The land lay quiet, grass heavy, sky pewter gray, the wind carrying only the creak of the barn door. He guided the horses inside, loosened the saddles, and rubbed them dry while she stood on the porch, staring at the valley below. From that height, Coldwater looked small, its rumors smaller still, but their echo still clung to her. When he returned, he found her still standing there, Samuel's coat wrapped around her like borrowed courage. "You can go back tomorrow," he said, voice even. "They'll be tired of talk by then." "You think so?" she asked. He gave a half smile that wasn't one. "No, but you'll learn to walk through it." She turned to him, wet hair framing her face. "You speak like a man who already has." "I stopped caring what people said when the one person worth listening to quit speaking," he said quietly, and she knew without asking he meant his late wife. For a long moment neither spoke. The rain softened to a hush. Then the porch door opened behind them, Tom, the ranch boy, peeking out, holding 2 chipped mugs. "Coffee's hot, sir," he said. His gaze lingered curiously on Evelyn. Mrs. Redden?" The name struck her like a chord too lovely to be hers. Samuel's glance warned the boy not to linger, but he didn't correct him. Evelyn took the mug, fingers brushing Samuel's for an instant, and warmth spread faster than the drink. They sat in silence, watching the fog drift across the meadow. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "The lie?" "The kindness," she said. "Kindness ain't something a man can afford to regret," he said. "It's the only thing he can take with him." The simplicity of it cut through her like prayer, but still the rift remained, visible, humming, dangerous. He rose, finished his coffee, and looked toward the barn. "I'll sleep out there. You take the loft." "I can manage a blanket by the fire," she offered. "Not under my roof," he said, a note of finality in his tone. "A man's got to keep one honest thing, even in a lie." She opened her mouth to protest, but stopped. The logic was cruel and pure all at once. He nodded toward the lamp. "Keep it lit. Storm will pass by dawn." He stepped into the rain. Crossing the yard to the barn, his figure swallowed by mist. Alone, Evelyn watched the glow from the barn window flicker like a heartbeat through the fog. She sat on the floor beside the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the blue ribbon laid carefully on the table. Its color had dulled, but it still carried warmth, as though the fire remembered where it had been. She thought of his words, of how easily he'd turned scandal into shelter, and of how quickly that shelter had turned into solitude. The wind shifted. Thunder rolled faintly beyond the hills. She whispered into the empty room, He says it's a lie, but the world already believes it. Then she looked toward the barn light again and wondered whether the man inside it still believed his own silence, or if somewhere beneath it he'd already begun to believe her. Night folded itself around the ranch like a worn blanket, heavy but familiar. The rain had stopped, leaving only the smell of wet cedar and the hiss of a fire that refused to die down. Evelyn sat near the hearth, hair unpinned, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her eyes half lost in the flames' slow dance. She'd tried reading one of the old farm ledgers to keep herself awake, but the words blurred into the memory of laughter. Her sister's laughter, the town's, even her own once, back when she believed being quiet made her safe. The door creaked. Samuel stepped in from the barn, shirt clinging damp to his shoulders, a lantern in one hand and exhaustion in the other. "Storm's done," he said simply, hanging his hat. "But the creek's risen. We're cut off till morning." Evelyn nodded. "Maybe that's mercy," she said softly. He looked at her, half smiling. "You got an odd way of seeing mercy." "It gives us one night nobody can reach," she answered. He walked to the fire, set the lantern down, and for a long while neither spoke. The silence wasn't the hard kind anymore. It was the kind that waited for permission. Finally, she broke it. "You never wanted Margaret, did you?" His head tilted slightly, but he didn't seem surprised. "Wantin' ain't the same as choosin'," he said. "She was what people said I should have. A name, a match, a proper smile. And me?" The question hung fragile, half daring. He poked the fire once before answering. "You were the one I wasn't supposed to notice." Her breath caught, not from romance, but from recognition. "Margaret used to take your letters," she confessed. "The ones you sent about the church fair, about your mother's passing. She threw them in the stove, said you'd forgotten her anyway." His hand stilled mid-motion. "She did what?" "I kept one," Evelyn whispered. She reached into the small bundle beside her and pulled out a folded sheet, edges browned with age. "You wrote, 'There's still kindness left in this valley, if only I could find where it hides.' I kept it because I needed to believe that kindness existed somewhere." Samuel looked at the paper as though it were a mirror he hadn't meant to face. "And now?" he asked. "Now I know where it was hiding," she said quietly. The fire cracked, sending a plume of sparks upward. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he reached into his coat and drew out the blue ribbon, laying it on the table between them. "I've carried this since that night," he said. "Couldn't make sense of why." "Because you knew it was mine." "No," he said softly. "Because I knew it didn't belong to the woman I thought I wanted." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "And what about the woman the town says you've taken?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "She deserves better than rumor." "And you?" "Deserve nothing," he said, though his tone betrayed him. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they couldn't yet say. The ribbon glowed faintly, catching the firelight like a breath between them. "You should sleep," he said at last, standing. "Tomorrow the creek'll drop and we'll have to face what we built." She looked up, voice trembling. "You mean the lie?" He paused at the door, glanced back once. "No," he said. "The truth that came after." Then he stepped into the hallway, leaving her with the sound of the fire, the letter, and the ribbon that no longer felt borrowed. The creek dropped by morning, but not enough to wash away what waited in town. By noon, a rider came pounding up the ridge, Tom's cousin from the livery, shouting over the wind, "Preacher's called a hearing! Noon bell tomorrow!" Samuel listened, face unreadable, while Evelyn stood behind him, the blue ribbon tied around her wrist like armor she hadn't earned. "A hearing," she whispered. "For what?" "For us," he said. "Town don't know how to forgive what it envies." That night, neither slept. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows across the walls like restless ghosts. He sharpened his old knife just to keep his hands busy. She mended one of Tom's shirts, though her eyes never left the window. When dawn came pale and bitter, they rode side by side down the ridge. Every hoofbeat sounded like a question neither could answer. Coldwater's church stood waiting, its white steeple stabbing the gray sky. The square below teemed with faces, farmers, wives, children, all pressed close as if righteousness required witnesses. Margaret stood near the front, her bonnet spotless, her expression carved from pride and fear. Sheriff Harlan tried to keep order, but the crowd buzzed like a hive. The preacher lifted his Bible and called, "Samuel Redden, Evelyn Ward, come forward." Samuel dismounted first, helped Evelyn down. Her knees trembled once, then steadied. Together they stepped onto the church porch. "You stand accused," the preacher intoned, "of deceiving this congregation, mocking holy vows, and causing scandal among God-fearing folk." Samuel's reply was steady as a hammer on anvil. "We stand accused of feeding gossip what it was already hungry for." Murmurs rippled. A few smiled despite themselves. Margaret's voice rose, sharp as broken glass. "He's a liar! She trapped him?" Evelyn turned, voice clear though her hands shook. "Trapped? No. I begged him to pretend, and he said yes. I thought it would save me from your cruelty. Instead, it saved me from thinking I was worthless." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. The preacher frowned. "So you admit deceit?" "I admit desperation," she said. "But if mercy counts for anything in this valley, then let it count here." Samuel stepped forward, taking her hand openly before them all. "She asked me to pretend," he said, "and I did. At first to spare her shame. Then because I saw what shame had done to good people too many times before." His eyes swept the crowd. "You talk of holiness. Maybe it's just honesty under fire." For a moment no one breathed. Margaret moved as if to speak again, but her mother's hand caught her wrist and stilled her. The preacher closed his book slowly. "There are sins of the flesh," he said, "and there are sins of the tongue. I reckon the Lord knows which runs deeper." He turned to the crowd. "You wanted truth. You've heard it. Go home." The murmuring broke like distant thunder, half relief, half confusion. Some nodded, others turned away, muttering. Margaret stood frozen, lips white. Evelyn exhaled shakily, the weight of 100 eyes lifting from her shoulders. Samuel squeezed her hand once, firm and sure. "Trial's done," he said quietly. "Not yet," she whispered, glancing toward the ribbon around her wrist. "One truth left to speak." He followed her gaze and understood. The proof she'd hidden for this moment. Tomorrow, before all of them, she would open it. The storm that had begun in laughter was about to end in revelation. The next morning rose clear and cruelly bright, the kind of sky that left no place for lies to hide. Coldwater's church bell began tolling before the hour, calling the town like judgment itself. Evelyn stood at the edge of the square with Samuel beside her. The blue ribbon looped around her wrist, its ends fluttering like two halves of a heart refusing to meet. The crowd had doubled since the day before. Farmers with mud still on their boots, women gripping Bibles, children tugging at their skirts to see the spectacle of sin and salvation. Margaret waited near the preacher's steps, her face powdered pale, her eyes sharp enough to wound. "Ready?" Samuel asked under his breath. "No," Evelyn whispered, "but I'm done running." Together they walked to the front, the crowd parting with the sound of fabric brushing and breath being held. The preacher lifted his Bible again, but she spoke first. "Yesterday I begged for mercy," she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "Today I bring truth." She raised her wrist and unwrapped the blue ribbon, slow and deliberate, the crowd leaning forward as the fabric uncoiled and revealed what it had been hiding all along. A folded packet of paper, worn and creased, bound tight for years. "These are letters," she said, "written by the man you mocked as proud and unreadable. Letters he sent to my sister when he thought she loved him. She never answered. She burned them to keep him waiting." A gasp rippled through the crowd, sharp as wind through glass. "But one," Evelyn continued, her voice rising, "one she never got to destroy because I kept it. And in it, he wrote not to her, but to this town. You all. He said he wished to live among people who still believed kindness wasn't weakness. I carried that letter through years of mockery because I needed to believe such a man existed." She turned toward Samuel, her eyes glistening. "Now I know he does." She handed the letter to the preacher, who took it like holy writ. The old man unfolded it, his lips moving as he read the words aloud, slow and trembling. "If decency is forgotten here, may the Lord send me one honest soul to remind me what grace looks like." The church fell silent. Even the horses outside stopped stamping. Samuel stood utterly still, eyes fixed on the dirt. Margaret's voice broke the silence, brittle and desperate. "She forged that! She lies!" But the preacher shook his head. "This is your handwriting, Samuel Redden." He turned the paper toward her sister. "And this ink," he glanced up, "ain't new." Margaret's face drained white as milk. She staggered back, her pride unraveling faster than the crowd's shock. Samuel spoke at last, his voice low, carved from shame and relief. "I wrote that long ago, thought it'd never matter." Evelyn turned towards the people, her voice soft but clear. "It mattered to me. It saved me." For the first time since she'd known him, Samuel met her gaze fully, his silence no longer armor but confession. The preacher closed the letter gently and said, "Then let the record show there was no mockery here, only mercy delayed." The crowd exhaled in one great breath, whispers turning from scorn to awe. Some even smiled, quietly ashamed of their hunger for cruelty. Margaret fled the square in tears, her footsteps swallowed by the dust she'd stirred. Evelyn's knees wavered. But Samuel caught her arm before she could fall, steady as always. "You kept my words safe," he murmured, "and you gave them back when I needed them most." "We both did," she said, her voice breaking. The preacher raised his hand for silence one last time and declared, "Let this day stand as proof that even lies can become truth if spoken for love, not pride." The bell tolled again, softer this time, not judgment but release, and when it ended, no one spoke at all, because in that golden hush of morning, every heart knew the truth had finally found its home. When the bell's echo faded and the murmurs dissolved into the soft shuffle of boots, Samuel Redden took off his hat, set it against his chest, and turned toward the woman who had just rewritten his life before the whole town. The sunlight had found her face, glinting off the loose strands of hair that had fallen from her braid, and for the first time he saw her not as the quiet girl who had begged him to pretend, but as the only person in that square who had dared to tell the truth when everyone else hid behind righteousness. The preacher lowered the Bible, the sheriff cleared his throat, and slowly, as if awaking from a dream, the townsfolk began to part, making a narrow path through the crowd. Samuel didn't move until Evelyn looked up, her eyes raw and wet but steady. Then, without a word, he reached out his hand. She hesitated only a breath before placing hers in his, her fingers cold, trembling, but alive. The square was still except for the creak of the church sign swinging in the wind. Together they began to walk. Every step sounded louder than the bell that had judged them an hour before. No one stopped them this time. Mrs. Carden bowed her head. The blacksmith crossed his arms and nodded once in quiet respect. A child whispered, "Are they leavin'?" And his mother hushed him, but even she couldn't take her eyes off the pair moving through sunlight and dust like figures from some older, kinder story. Margaret's voice never came. She was gone, the trail of her pride cold already. When they reached the edge of the square, Samuel turned briefly to the crowd. "You've had your truth," he said simply, voice carrying across the still air. "Now let us keep ours." Then he guided Evelyn toward the waiting wagon at the hitching post. Tom stood there, wide-eyed, holding the reins. He'd polished the harness till it gleamed, as if he knew this moment would matter for the rest of his life. "Where to, sir?" he asked. Samuel helped Evelyn up before answering. "Home," he said, the single word heavy with meanings no one could untangle. They rode through town without hurry, the wagon wheels crackling over dry earth, and everywhere they passed, shutters opened quietly, not for curiosity but apology. At the church door, the preacher watched them go. The folded letter pressed against his chest like scripture that had finally come true. The sun climbed higher, bleaching the world in gold, and for the first time in weeks, Samuel felt the air loosen in his lungs. Beside him, Evelyn kept her gaze forward, the blue ribbon now tied around her hat brim where everyone could see. "You think they'll forget?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "No, but they'll remember different." They reached the ridge as noon flared bright, the valley below shimmering like a sea of forgiveness. Evelyn exhaled, shoulders easing, eyes filling with something too light to be tears. "I thought the truth would break us," she said. "Maybe it did," he replied, "but what's left after breaking might just be real." The wagon creaked up the last incline, and as they crossed the rise, a gust of wind caught the ribbon and sent one end fluttering free, bright against the endless blue sky. Neither of them tried to tie it back. The road ahead stretched long and empty, the kind that could turn anywhere a heart was willing to begin again. And as they rode out of sight of the church, the bell rang once more, not for a trial or a sermon, but like a farewell blessing whispered over two souls who had finally learned that walking away could sometimes mean staying true. Weeks passed, and the gossip that once burned like prairie fire finally thinned into smoke that drifted off and vanished over the hills. The town went back to its chores and its prayers, and only the echo of that hearing lingered, half warning, half wonder, about how truth had walked out holding a liar's hand and made the world quiet for a while. At Samuel's ranch, the grass had grown tall again, soft against the fences, and the air smelled of hay and sun-warmed wood. Evelyn woke early each morning, her hair pinned loosely, her sleeves rolled as she carried water from the well, humming under her breath without noticing. Samuel often watched from the porch, coffee in hand, his face softer than it had been in years, the lines of solitude erased by something too gentle to name. The ribbon, faded now to the color of the dawn, hung from the corner of the fence where he'd tied it the day they returned. It fluttered whenever the wind passed, a quiet sentinel between what they had pretended and what they had become. Some days the townsfolk rode by on their way to market, slowing their horses near the gate, tipping hats or nodding silently. No one spoke of the lie anymore. The story had turned into something the valley simply accepted, like the changing of seasons or the stubbornness of grass after rain. Tom still worked the stables, whistling tunelessly, and sometimes in the evenings he'd tell the younger hands how Mr. and Mrs. Redden had once stood before the preacher and made the whole county swallow its tongue. They'd laugh, but even the laughter carried respect. Inside the house, life unfolded quiet as breathing. Evelyn's mended clothes hung beside his. 2 mugs always stood waiting by the kettle. The silence between them had learned to feel like peace instead of distance. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted everything gold, she found Samuel at the fence line fixing a loose board. "It's coming loose again," he said without looking up. She stepped beside him, hands gentle on the wood. "Maybe it wants to remind us that not everything meant to hold stays tight forever." He glanced at her, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe." Her gaze lifted to the ribbon fluttering above them, its threads thin but unbroken. "You ever think of taking it down?" she asked. "No," he said. "Some things belong where the wind can find them." The words settled between them, easy, final. Right. The evening breeze picked up, carrying the scent of sage and smoke, brushing against their faces like a blessing. She leaned against the rail, close enough that their shoulders touched, and together they watched the sun sink behind the ridge, the same ridge they'd once ridden down in shame and left as something stronger. A pair of crows crossed the sky, black shapes against the crimson light, and the last sound of the day was their cry fading into quiet. As dusk fell, the ribbon caught the last of the sunlight and gleamed for an instant before the dark took it. It didn't need to shine anymore. Its work was done. The lie had turned into truth, the wounded had become whole, and the land itself seemed to exhale in relief. Tomorrow would be chores and weather and ordinary life again, but tonight the frontier rested, wrapped in calm, holding 2 souls who had learned that sometimes salvation doesn't come in thunder. It comes in the soft rustle of a ribbon on a fence, waving not to be seen, but simply to remember. When she unwrapped that blue ribbon and read his old words aloud, do you think she freed him, or herself? If you were Samuel, would you have told the truth sooner, or waited for someone brave enough to bring it into the light? Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind.